And let's center our attention to the misleading concept that removing leaves on young shoots will focus the vine's energy into growing the shoot or the new leaves, enabling the shoot to grow faster. Okay, this is a concept that I've heard all too many, especially new growers, talk about and get wrong in the vineyard. And I see growers doing this often when they're first starting out. So it really can set vines back if you get this wrong. The vine is not wasting energy on leaves that are already mature. Mature leaves that are usually near the base of a shoot, the larger leaves, are contributors. They're acting as solar panels, if you will, and they're creating photosynthase, creating carbohydrates, nutrient movement, and it's only the mature leaves that can contribute the net carbohydrates to push the shoot tips up above to keep growing. So the main goal of any young vine training strategy is to maximize new growth that can be retained as permanent vine structure. So that means you're developing your trunk, number one. If you're doing spur pruning, you're going to develop cordons or spur positions. So you need to leave the leaves alone on your young shoots because the older leaves are helping those younger leaves to grow and thrive. So we have the concept that competition from undervine cover crops is good for vines. And when I say undervine, I don't mean in the vine row where the tractor's driving. I'm talking about growers who are actively trying to grow some form of cover crop directly under the vines, right where the trunk is. The misheard part of this statement can be small, but can be very impactful, especially to a young vineyard. What you need to correctly hear is that competition with undervine cover crops can be good for vines, depending on the age and vigor of the vines and the rainfall throughout the season and type of soil at a particular site. So there's a lot of caveats there. Let's just unpack those a little bit. It's important to understand the situations where competition from undervine cover crops should be used and should not be used in a vineyard scenario. So let's walk through it. I would say that competition from undervine cover crops is not good for vines if usually your vines are young, like 1 to 3 years, and they haven't developed their permanent vine structure like trunks or cordons. We don't really want to compete with vines. We want to make sure vines have a good start. We don't want undervine cover crops directly competing with the root system and nutrient uptake of young vines. So typically, young vineyards will not implement undervine cover crops. Your vines also need to be shown with a history to produce a full-size shoot or canopy. That means 4 feet of canopy or more with good vigor, uniform growth, and dark green foliage. And if you can do all of that and still have a sustainable yield, you could probably begin to investigate the use of underground cover crops if you need to, let's say, control vigor and reduce the amount of growth. That's really where these undervine cover crops are being used, not just for erosion protection, not just for building soil health, but in some cases actually to provide a little bit of competition with an overly vigorous canopy. So my point is, if you're not in a high vigor situation and you're already struggling to get a full canopy, undervine cover cropping is probably not a good thing for you during the growing season. The exception would be for winter cover cropping underneath the vines. And okay, so let's visit where competition from undervine cover crops can be good for vines. I would say if you have very vigorous vines, they're 4 years or older, you have ample water supply and or rainfall during the season, you have very good soil with basically all of the nutrients required for vine growth, and maybe even a high vigor vine situation. Growing a small cover crop or a low growing cover crop under the vines could actually help moderate vigor and balance vines. And if your vines are 4 years or older and have no problems achieving full canopy size or desired crop levels, and you're testing your vine tissues for nutrient content and not realizing any nutritional deficiencies, your vineyard would then be a candidate for implementing the use of undervine cover crops. And I want to address the issue of applying complete fertilizers when your vineyard is low in only 1 or 2 nutrients. This made the countdown because I'm continuously surprised at how many growers continue to do this each season, thinking that adding more of all these nutrients to their vineyard will help things overall. So let's dig into the concept a bit more and talk about complete fertilizer. So complete fertilizer is something like a 10-10-10 or a triple 13, That stands for the NPK content and the percentage. So 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. That's an NPK. And sometimes these fertilizers will also have an array of micronutrients. It could be magnesium, it could be boron, zinc, other things that are added there to make it a complete fertilizer. We think of things like Miracle Grow fertilizer brand. That's a complete fertilizer that some gardeners use in their tomato plants. And yes, you can overdo it in the garden too. But when all of the fertilizers are needed due to a need for improved vigor, or because your plant tissue test results show that you need N, P, and K all put into the system, it might make sense to use a complete fertilizer. Also, the other time when complete fertilizers make sense is when your vines are young, like in their first or second year, and you just want to make sure that that relatively small root system of that vine has access to all of the fertilizers that it needs, because the soil may have adequate fertilizer in it, but the root system has to grow into that soil to reach those nutrients, especially nutrients that are not mobile, like phosphorus, or that are lesser mobile, like potassium. So if your vines are young and you want to make sure that that relatively small root system at that vine age has access to complete nutrition, you may opt to use those during years 1 and 2. But after that, you're going to start to do your plant tissue testing and hopefully only apply what's needed. Because using complete fertilizers in any other scenario can have negative or unhelpful impacts on your vines. So let's say you're applying fertilizers that are not needed, and now you have excess vigor, especially if you're applying too much nitrogen or too much potassium when it's not needed, because those tend to be the two major drivers of vine vigor in the vineyard. And if you drive too much vegetative growth, that can interfere with fruit set, flowering, that could also cause issues with overall yield, and it could cause a crowded canopy, which is more prone to bunch rots, less airflow, more difficult to manage and spray. So don't be putting out nitrogen or potassium unless you know the vines need them, or unless the vine tissue tests you're taking show that they're lacking. Also, application of some fertilizers can lead to competition with uptake with other nutrients. For example, if magnesium is typically low in plant tissues based on your test results, either at bloom or veraison when you test your whole leaves or your petioles, if you add potassium to the soil and you don't need it, and in fact, if you add potassium with that triple 10 and you're actually low in magnesium, potassium can flood the soil's cation exchange, and potassium can block or interfere magnesium uptake because you're literally flooding that cation exchange with more of those positive potassium cations, and therefore you have less room for the magnesium to hang out and be taken up by roots. So also, if you're using routine phosphorus additions in your vineyard, that can lead to competition for uptake by zinc by vine roots. So if you're routinely applying NPK fertilizers like 10-10-10 or triple 13, then check to be sure that all of those nutrients are needed before you continue that practice as your vineyard matures. You might only need some nitrogen and phosphorus and not that potassium, in which case you could apply either a diammonium or a monoammonium phosphate fertilizer, and that will totally leave that potassium out of the equation.